Good evening, everyone, and welcome to SCOTONOMICS. Tonight we've got a really fascinating interview with Dr. Tim Rideout, and we're looking at the Scottish Central Bank and all those Scottish Reserve Bank and all those wonderful things around central banks and monetary policy. And we delve into a lot more in our interview. The first thing to do is to welcome my co-host, Kairin van Sweden.
Good evening, William.
Hi, Kairin. Nice to see you. What have you been up to this week?
I'm being quite busy, but today I went on Radio Scotland again because there was some discussion about the First Minister coming out against CAMBO yesterday in the Parliament, and that's caused a great deal of controversy for some in more conservative quarters. But certainly in the environmental movement, they're very happy to see that. So that came up via the Friends of the Earth, I think, posted today on Twitter. And then it was discussed on Radio Scotland. So there was a guest on who inferred that Scotland didn't have much in the way of energy. So I felt that I had to phone up and explain that that was not the case. So I explained very clearly how much renewable energy Scotland has, and that the issue is that it has not been developed. So, for example, in 2010, when the coalition came in, Dundee was primed and pumped to become Solar City. And when I arrived in Dundee, people were going about with tote bags and there was all kinds of things going on. It was going to become the Solar City of the UK because it does get the most sun. And that funding was just pulled. And then also there was supposed to be a cable going between Orkney and the mainland because they have an excess of energy in Orkney, which they could export to mainland. And the funding was pulled. That was Ed Davey who decided to pull that funding as well. So the issue is not that we don't have energy. The issue is that it hasn't been developed. And the currency issuer, that's the UK government, decided not to do that development. And the only thing that I can say to environmentalists is that I guess that is all about keeping Scotland under the thumb.
Yeah, well, I'm glad they let you onto Radio Scotland because I know it's not the first time you've been on, so it's good that you're getting through their little net there. I went to university in Dundee for 4 years, and I saw the sun about 5 times. So I will argue blue in the face that thing about Dundee being the sunniest city cannot be true. Well, it wasn't the 4 years I was there anyway. I've not really been up to that much this week, catching up on COP. And yeah, I was really pleased to see Nicola Sturgeon's announcement about CAMBO, and I just think that similar kind of a COP and microcosm there is that we need to make sure that it's not just words and it's actions, because the Scottish Government through planning and through various other measures can do a lot to stymie CAMBO if the UK Government go ahead with it. So I really hope it's actions as well as words. And that leads us nicely on to our interview this evening, I think. Do you want to do a little introduction?
Yes, so this evening we are interviewing Dr. Tim Rideout, and he is bringing forth an enabling, or rather a resolution for an enabling bill to establish a Scottish Central Bank. And that will be going to the next SNP Conference, which starts on the 26th of November. So without further ado, let's see what Dr. Tim Rideout had to say. Good afternoon, Dr. Tim Rideout. It's great to have you on SCOTONOMICS, and we haven't had very many Scottish economists on, so it's great that you're here today. Could you tell our audience something about your academic background?
Okay, well, I've actually done quite a few degrees because I did a BA honours at the University of Cape Town, which was what in South Africa they call a double major, so it was in geography and economics. And then I did a master's degree, which was in economic geography, also in Cape Town. And then end of 1984, I came to Edinburgh and did a PhD again, was in economic geography, and that was at Edinburgh University.
Now, tell me, why and when did you become more interested in central banking?
Well, I've had to find out about central banks simply because I've been trying to make sure that the policy for Scotland when it becomes independent is that we will have our own currency as soon as possible. And that was back in 2016, 2017. And over the period since then, I've had to find out about what what part the central bank plays in introducing the currency in considerable detail.
Okay, and when you did that, Tim, were there things that surprised you?
There were sort of issues that I wasn't aware of. I think I've had to look at the sort of the details of the double entry accounting that underlie the banking system, and things which are not obvious to people, like the fact that what you could refer to as central bank money or base money never actually leaves the central bank. So you might be rather surprised to discover that the sort of £1 trillion or so that is in Bank of England reserve accounts could never actually leave the Bank of England. It just goes round between those accounts.
I think that probably is surprising for a lot of people to really understand the double entry bookkeeping aspect of it as well. So could you explain to our audience what the core functions of a central bank are?
I suppose at its basics, the central bank is the banker's bank. So in the sense that an individual has a bank account at Santander or Barclays, then and a company like my own XYZ Maps, we have a bank account. In our case, it's at Santander, and that's where the company's money sits. The same thing applies to a bank. So Barclays is a company, and Barclays therefore has a bank account. The people who provide the bank account to the commercial banks are the central bank. So Barclays money, the money which belongs to Barclays as opposed to Barclays customers, is in its account at the Bank of England.
Yeah, so I was going to say, so the central bank really, to a great extent, controls the commercial banks. It regulates the commercial banks.
Yes, it's the monetary authority, so it's responsible for the integrity and stability and so forth of the financial system.
And I believe as well that it supports and regulates the payment system.
In the case of the UK, the sterling payment system, which is the means by which money would get from, say, your account in Santander to your friend's account in Barclays, is going via a sort of a hybrid payment system, which is partly done by the commercial banks and mostly owned and regulated by the Bank of England.
Tim, we had a really interesting conversation with Olaf Margersson, who is on the reserve board at the Icelandic Central Bank. And he said during the financial crisis in 2008, the most important thing that the Central Bank of Iceland did was to continue to allow payments to circulate in the Icelandic economy, meaning the economy didn't crash. And he said that this payments aspect of a central bank is often something that's misunderstood and never really spoken about its importance. Would you agree that's a crucial role for a bank? And what would happen if we didn't have a central bank that was able to help us keep money flowing if we had any kind of financial crisis again?
Well, this actually touches on one of my points about sterlingization, which is that would this as proposed by the Growth Commission, the idea that Scotland could just carry on using sterling. Well, you can't really, because that's exactly what you're suggesting. It's trying to use a currency without a payments network, because the payments network is managed and largely run by the Bank of England. So if we cut ourselves off from the Bank of England by becoming independent, then we get disconnected from the payments network, and it then becomes impossible to send money from one bank to another bank. The payment system is absolutely crucial, and certainly, I think one of the things that the Scottish Currency Group is suggesting is that in an independent Scotland, we don't have the UK-style hybrid system. We have a payments network that is 100% owned and regulated by the central bank, and which the commercial banks simply use but don't have any ownership or control over.
I think the other important point to touch on for our audience as well is that the central bank is also the creator of the currency as well. Do you want to elaborate a little bit more for the audience about that particular function?
I'm not sure whether I'd quite say that the central bank's the creator of the currency. It sort of does that as the agent of the treasury, but it's really it's the national treasury or the finance ministry, or whatever, which creates the currency by issuing spending into the economy, and the central bank is simply the agent that actually implements those payments. So it's really a sort of two-person dance between the national treasury and the central bank that actually creates the currency.
You have a resolution ready for the SNP Conference on a Scottish central bank. Why do you want to bring this resolution forward right now?
Part of the resolution that the Dalkeith branch submitted, which was I'm the secretary of the Dalkeith branch, was about drafting the legislation or getting a draft bill ready for the establishment of the Scottish Reserve Bank as the future central bank of Scotland. And that's simply that we need to be ready. So, there's no reason why that can't be done in advance of having a referendum or whatever it is that secures independence. And if we do have that ready, then that shortens the timetable and means that we have much more chance of being ready to introduce the currency a month or two after the formal Independence Day. And that's important because it's extremely dangerous to carry on using sterling for more than a very short time after Independence Day.
Tim, you said a couple of months after independence. Is that when you'd be suggesting that we would move from using sterling to using the Scottish currency after a couple of months of the Independence Day?
Yes, at most. So if Independence Day was the 30th of November 2025, St Andrew's Day, then you'd be introducing the currency, for example, at the last weekend in January, something of that sort of order.
Great. So this could be months after winning independence, but when we set an official date for our move to an independent country.
Yeah, I think the sort of timetable people seem to envisage is that if there was a vote in September 2023, you'd be talking about the actual date of independence being 2 to 3 years later, which is why I suggested St Andrew's Day 2025 as your formal thing that's going to go down in the history book as the Independence Day.
Great.
It's you're certainly not independent the day after you have a vote for independence, because that's just not the way it happens. That starts the process. In India, for example, the process of independence really started in 1945 with the appointment of Mountbatten as the viceroy. The actual Independence Day wasn't until August 1947.
Could you also explain to our audience as well the importance of having your central bank and your currency in place for independence?
With a very short-term agreement with the Bank of England to allow it and support the transition, then we can manage to carry on using sterling for a couple of months after Independence Day. But we can't do it much longer than that because the Bank of England wouldn't allow it. That would mean that they were allowing foreign banks to access the UK payment system. They were an independent Scotland would be expecting the Bank of England to provide funding to what's a completely foreign bank that has nothing to do with the UK anymore. And they're not going to do that. They've made it quite clear that they're not going to provide a sort of de facto currency union with Scotland after independence. So we need to take that as a warning and make sure that we are ready for the day when the Bank of England says, right, you're on your own.
So, Tim, do you think that there's a wide misunderstanding about central banks and that successive UK governments often try to paint them as independent institutions when in fact they are actually answerable to elected politicians? I mean, I see this happening also with the Oil and Gas Authority. Do you think that's the case?
Yes, although I'd say this is a recent phenomenon, that the idea that you pretend that the central bank isn't part of the government and it's not part of the state really just goes back to maybe the 1980s. It didn't happen in the UK until 1998 when 1998, 1990, yeah, the Banking Act 1998 when Gordon Brown decided that he was going to restore independence to the Bank of England, which it was nationalised in 1946 precisely to make it clear that it wasn't independent.
Yeah, I think this is something that is an act of smoke and mirrors on the part of the UK government. And I think it's quite deliberate. So I know that your resolution has been quite shortened, quite drastically shortened for conference, but there are a couple of points that you make in the long form version. The first is that the central bank should be active in ensuring full employment and on national resilience as well. So how do you envisage the central bank contributing towards these goals as opposed to politicians?
Well, it can ensure that, or contribute towards ensuring that the money is available for the politicians to implement policies which will create full employment. There's been a tendency amongst politicians for various reasons to try and put a sort of a buffer organisation in between them and the voters. So, instead of politicians accepting that they're responsible for regulating the oil and gas industry, they set up a sort of a quango that they say, oh, well, we've handed that over to the oil and gas authority, so it's their job. And if something goes wrong, then the politicians say, nothing to do with us, it's them.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is a cop-out. And it's just a sort of means of hiding behind some unelected body. But ultimately, as a president of the United States had the sign on his desk, the buck stops here, and it stops with the politicians who are in power. And it should be made to stop with them. So, if there's massive unemployment, it's their job to do something about it. To achieve that, then you should be using fiscal policy, which is, the government spending and taxation, and not expecting central bankers to try and bail you out of a hole instead.
Yeah. It's interesting because that's what Claudia Sam, who worked at the Fed, said was happening very much in the States, that it was being pushed towards the Fed to solve some of these problems. And she was encouraging people to understand that the Fed works on behalf of the government. And there definitely was this, I really like that phrase of a buffer organization between the politicians and the public, and the central bank did seem to be taking some flack. And Claudia had said that the Fed wasn't popular because it had been portrayed as this institution that had all the power, and obviously it didn't have that. Well, now that I've got you, I'd like to discuss my kind of pet topic, which is the Sustainable Growth Commission. And you mentioned it earlier, and I just wanted you to expand on this idea of sterlingization.
Sterlingization, the Growth Commission plan. I mean, it's an interesting thing to talk about. But for Scotland as a large, relatively large developed economy, to try to use the currency of another country, which is what you're saying would happen, that we would be an independent country using sterling, which is the currency of our next door neighbor. That would be a rather radical experiment in monetary policy, because no other developed country, sophisticated economy, has ever tried to use somebody else's currency. The Eurozone isn't a case of using somebody else's currency, because it's a currency union with a shared currency, and that's completely different. What we're talking about with sterlingization is using a completely foreign currency over which we have no control, and we're going to expect everything to carry on as it did before independence, and it won't. People might hold up.
That is such a good perspective, because it is something radical, and I certainly think that the SNP administration is trying to sell that as some kind of way to transition. But as you said, no one else is doing this. It's completely untried. So many more countries have launched their own currency than have kept the currency of another developed neighbouring nation. So no, it's a really, really good perspective. But this takes me back to the Sustainable Growth Commission. This is part of a semi-official document that is backed by this administration. This doesn't look commensurate with the resolution that you're making about the Scottish Bank, the Scottish Reserve Bank.
Well, it isn't commensurate with the Growth Commission. What I've been doing since April 2019 is to torpedo the Growth Commission and sink it into the Mariana Trench, because it's a completely ludicrous. The Appendix C stuff is completely ludicrous. And as you say, the idea that you can just carry on using sterling, and people say, oh, but Panama uses the US dollar. It's I had the House of Parliament Library look into Panama. So almost all transactions in Panama are carried out in cash. They discovered that 90% of Panamanians have never actually done a digital transaction. So all they have to do is to have enough dollar bills in circulation to allow the economy to function in cash. And that's not the situation in Scotland at all, where we're 97% digital in terms of payments. A lot of people probably don't even use banknotes at all. And that means that we have to rely on the computer networks between the banks, which are controlled by the Bank of England. So they're controlled by a foreign country. Why is that foreign country going to process our payments for us? It won't. So, the sterlingization risks a complete breakdown of the banking system and paralysis of the economy.
Yeah, and one thing I'd like to add to that is, because I agree with you in principle, but of course the Bank of England could do that. It could definitely say, yeah, we'll keep processing your payments, and we'll allow you to use this, but at what cost? And how does this impact all the other things that we've got to negotiate and our role as an independent nation if we give across this hugely fundamentally important part to the Bank of England?
You are effectively then negotiating a de facto currency union, and you would have to agree that the Bank of England would have full control over all financial institutions in Scotland, and we would have to do whatever they tell us to do in terms of regulation, how the banks work, interest rates, what reserves they need to keep, and so on. So all of that is handed over to London.
But within the Sustainable Growth Commission, I think that's what's implied. And again, I think you've highlighted a slightly different perspective on the Sustainable Growth Commission, is that it is a de facto currency union, because the Sustainable Growth Commission talks about grandfathering of regulations from the financial services industry. And it kind of says, without saying it, we'll do very much business the same as it is happening in Westminster and the City of London and in England. And I don't think that's been made clear enough within the discussions around the Sustainable Growth Commission. Would you agree that that's there? It's maybe just a bit hidden.
When we become independent, then all the existing law stays as it is until such time as we change it. So the laws on financial regulation will be exactly what they are at the moment until we pass something different. And I think we will do that. We've been looking at that in the working group on regulation within the Scottish Currency Group, and I think we're moving very strongly towards suggesting a Canadian model of financial regulation for the banks, which has things like banking licenses expire after 5 years and have to be renewed every 5 years. Bankers have to be professionally qualified, otherwise they're not allowed to serve in senior positions in the banks. Mergers of large banks are not allowed. And interestingly, Canada didn't have any particular problem with its banks in 2008. We have to actually legislate for that and change it.
Absolutely. And I think most independent supporters would be aghast if they thought that our regulations were going to be the same as what's currently happening in the City of London. So it's really good to think about how we can do this differently. And as you said, it would be impossible for us to do that if we were in some kind of de facto currency union or under sterlingization.
And the interesting point for people is that as I understand it, and I'm not as expert on the Canada model as our convener of the working group, Dr. Robbie Mockery from Heriot-Watt University, but the Canadian banking regulatory system is essentially the Scottish one from the 19th century. It was set up by Scots in Canada, and they've kept it going, whereas we outsourced it to London. So we are if we do go with recommending a Canadian style system, then we're just bringing back the traditionally prudent Scottish approach to finance that we managed to lose ourselves.
Yeah, I noticed on LinkedIn yesterday that the Bank of England it's writing about a central bank digital currency. Would you like to give our audience some of your thoughts on that, Tim?
Well, I'm a bit skeptical about central bank digital currencies because I don't, there is a technical solution, and it's a technical solution. It's all to do with sort of new computer technology and things, and therefore it's sort of sexy and flavor of the moment. But I don't quite see what the problem is that it's trying to address. We already have a digital currency. As I said, 97% of transactions in Scotland, you waft your card at the card reader. That's a digital currency. Why do you need another digital currency? But I'm prepared to be convinced that there is a reason why or benefit to somebody as to why you might have a central bank digital currency, which effectively is there's a central bank paper currency, which is the banknote. And I think the central bank digital currency is designed to be a sort of digital replacement for a banknote that would then be issued by the central bank and not a commercial bank. But as I say, you'd have to ask what the benefit is and benefit to who. Now, one of the pioneers in central bank digital currencies is the Bank of China in the People's Republic. And unquestionably, they're doing it in order to exercise control over the citizens, because if you're using a central bank digital currency to make all your payments, it means the central bank has a record of everything you purchase. And if they decide that you're a bit subversive and they don't like you, they can just hand it over to the security police and disconnect you from the system. So you could be left with no money, no ability to make any payments, and with the security police chasing after you. So that's a benefit for the state, but I think it's probably not a benefit for the citizen.
Yeah, this is something that I understood as well from it, that literally the government can really just look at what you're spending money on. I guess the pros, from what I understand as well, is that the commercial banking sector have certainly let down the population in the more rural aspects of Scotland as well. So I think that might be a selling point for it. What do you think about that?
Well, I would tend to say that we should use an existing state-owned network, which we're going to inherit, known as the post office. And, perhaps if the banks are not really interested in providing people who don't have lots of money with banking facilities, then we have a people's bank, or like the German Sparkasse or something like that, that operates through the post office and, will provide basic banking and a sort of payment card or whatever to everybody. And that seems to me a much, that's existing technology, doesn't require anything sort of untried. The post office already has branches all over the country. It's got more branches probably than most of the banks, if not all the banks. And it can provide cash for businesses and things like that. And basic accounts, the payment card, already does things like foreign exchange for going on holiday. So why not build on that? And it can work with the central bank, so that the central bank ensures that it's adequately funded and solvent and so forth, without any requirement to hand over to the state all the details of every single thing you've ever purchased.
Tim, I wanted to get your views on local currencies. I'm sure you've had the Brixton pound and the Bristol pound, and how would that play a role within the financial services sector in an independent Scotland?
Yeah, I've actually seen the banknotes which the city of Bristol printed, and they're proper banknotes that look very similar to the sort of things that the Bank of England does. You can do that. I mean, it's the idea behind local currency is to try and get the money to actually circulate in the local area. So if you have Bristol pounds, you can only spend them in Bristol. You can't use them to buy something on Amazon. Let's try to get people to sort of go to local shops and buy things locally, rather than I think there was a story a few years ago that when the upgrade of the road between Ullapool and Inverness was completed, businesses in Ullapool were suddenly severely disadvantaged, because all the people who bought in, the local people in Ullapool who went to the Ullapool shops, started doing a once a week trip to Inverness to go to the supermarket instead. So if you had an Ullapool currency which could only be used in Ullapool, that would sort of discourage that. But I think it's, in some senses, having a local currency is something we could do now without having to wait for independence. In that something like Edinburgh City Council could have a currency for Edinburgh, but I think there's a problem in that people are not using banknotes very much, so it's much more difficult to have a digital local currency than it is to just print some banknotes and use those. It gets much more technically expensive to have payment cards and a network that can process those payments. So I probably suspect that local currencies would have a limited role in Scotland, either now or before or after independence.
And I think it's a really great idea. And also interestingly, Olafur Margeirsson from Iceland was saying that in Iceland, they actually had their own currency before they became independent. So clearly having your own currency before we become independent is perhaps a way to move towards that too. But yeah, the other thing I wanted to ask you, Tim, as well, before we finish, is you had another resolution for conference, which is about the civil service in an independent Scotland. And I think when you understand that the money from the civil service is essentially coming down through the Treasury, going into the civil service, and then spent out into the wider economy, you then realise how toxic it has been for the United Kingdom that so much of that civil service has been concentrated in one city, which is London, which is why it becomes really essential to think about your resolution when you're talking about spreading the civil service throughout an independent Scotland. Do you want to just give us a few points about that before we finish the show?
The resolution basically says that if we follow the example of Denmark, we're going to have something like 50,000 civil servants, core civil servants in the Scottish government. At the moment, the Scottish government's about 7,500 civil servants, so it's pretty small. It's nowhere near what is necessary to run things like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Defence, Ministry of Finance, and all the sort of things which we don't have at the moment. So there's going to need to be a lot of new positions, and the resolution says that they should be allocated to all 32 councils in proportion to the existing population of that council, and that we give a premium of 20% or more to councils which we deem to be currently disadvantaged or remote or very rural. So that's places like the Helen and Shire, Orkney, Shetland, Dumfries and Galloway, or perhaps Inverclyde as an example of a deprived area. So they would get a boost in extra jobs. And to put some numbers on this sort of policy would mean maybe 2,000 jobs going to Dumfries and Galloway, which could be a ministry. It could be something like the Ministry of Agriculture having its headquarters in Dumfries, and that, as Karen said, that's a major local employer source of money going into the local economy, not just from wages, but from contracts, buying IT support, catering, cleaning services, whatever else they would need going into that local area. We certainly don't want to make the mistake of the UK and put, another 40,000 civil service jobs into Edinburgh.
Yeah. Do you think that fundamentally spreading your civil service around any country, and I know that Germany does this differently I think everyone does this differently from the UK, that if you spread your civil service around the country, and the money is flowing, as we understand it, from the government to the civil service and then out into the private economy, not vice versa, which is many people's perception, that would create much better economic stability in an independent Scotland.
I think it's more about fairness and regional development and having a balanced economy. The UK is an exceptionally unbalanced economy because you have one part of the country, the southeast of England, which they say, oh, we're doing fantastically. We're southeast of England's absolutely booming. The rest of England's going down the toilet, and that's not a healthy situation at all. It's not healthy for people's mental well-being and things because, for example, in the north of England, the children are going to leave because they'll get down to London. I mean, that happens in Scotland as well. In S-Bank, quite a lot of our neighbours are fairly elderly, and I think all the children except one from our 4 neighbours have move to London for jobs. That's not a good situation. It's not good environmentally either, because you have underused resources in the north of England, that houses which are empty, factories and things are all falling down because people aren't using them for anything. And yet in the southeast, then you've got a shortage of water. There's a chronic shortage of housing. It's ridiculously expensive. Everything's crammed into one area. That's really, it's a terrible way to run a country.
Kairin's point there, it is, no one else really does it like this. It is the United Kingdom. It's an anomaly. One point I wanted to say, that the Scottish economy will be a very complex system. And one of the ways that you support a complex system is by having resilience and having these councils that have got their own, jobs have been planted there, and they have better economies. It makes the whole economy more resilient. And when we look at the UK economy at the moment, it's not a resilient economy, because so much is down to London and the southeast, and we could definitely move away from that with a different economic approach for Scotland.
The SNP Scottish government is as guilty of trying to sort of centralise everything as London, and they really should stop dictating to local government, and say, well, you have to do this and you have to do that, and all this money's ring fenced, and we're going to tell you how to spend it. You need to allow local people to take responsibility, and the council should be able to collect much more of their own revenue and decide how to spend it.
Absolutely.
We should also take on board Leslie Riddoch's point that we have councils which are far too big.
Yeah, and you can see really on a very logical level why that is going to be better for your economy, really, and this, moving away from this concentration of wealth in just one area. Tim, that's been a fantastic interview, and I think it's been very enlightening for our listeners. And if you are an SNP member and you are a delegate at conference, then I think you should vote for this resolution, of course. Yeah, I hope that this programme has helped to enlighten those who are going to conference and are voting on it.
What will be interesting to see at conferences, if there's any attempt by the sort of anti-having our own currency people in the leadership to sort of try and sabotage the resolution by telling people to vote against it, or to remit back or something like that. So we'll have to see.
It's going to be an interesting test, absolutely, to see if we've come anywhere in the last 12 months.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
I think we've used enough of your time, Tim. Thank you so much for coming to SCOTONOMICS.
Thanks, Tim. You're welcome.